Hello everyone, and welcome back to Project Moon Audiobooks. This is part 2 of the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Not until it was twilight did Gregor awake out of a deep sleep, more like a swoon than a sleep. He would certainly have waked up of his own accord not much later, for he felt himself sufficiently rested and well slept, but it seemed to him as if a fleeting step and a cautious shutting of the door leading into the hall had aroused him. The electric lights in the street cast a pale sheen here and there on the ceiling and the upper surfaces of the furniture, but down below, where he lay, it was dark. Slowly, awkwardly trying out his feelers, which he now first learned to appreciate, he pushed his way to the door to see what had been happening there. His left side felt like one single long, unpleasantly tense scar, and he had actually to limp on his 2 rows of legs. One little leg, moreover, had been severely damaged in the course of that morning's events. It was almost a miracle that only one had been damaged, and trailed uselessly behind him. He had reached the door before he discovered what had really drawn him to it, the smell of food. For there stood a basin filled with fresh milk, in which floated little sops of white bread. He could almost have laughed with joy, since he was now still hungrier than in the morning, and he dipped his head almost over the eyes straight into the milk. But soon in disappointment, he withdrew it again. Not only did he find it difficult to feed because of his tender left side, and he could only feed with the palpitating collaboration of his whole body, he did not like the milk either, although milk had been his favorite drink, and that was certainly why his sister had set it there for him. Indeed, it was almost with repulsion that he turned away from the basin and crawled back to the middle of the room. He could see through the crack of the door that the gas was turned on in the living room, but while usually at this time his father made a habit of reading the afternoon newspaper in a loud voice to his mother and occasionally to his sister as well, not a sound was now to be heard. Well, perhaps his father had recently given up this habit of reading aloud, which his sister had mentioned so often in conversation and in her letters. But there was the same silence all around, although the flat was certainly not empty of occupants. "What a quiet life our family has been leading," said Gregor to himself, and as he sat there motionless, staring into the darkness, he felt great pride in the fact that he had been able to provide such a life for his parents and sister in such a fine flat. But what if all the quiet, the comfort, the contentment were now to end in horror? To keep himself from being lost in such thoughts, Gregor took refuge in movement and crawled up and down the room. Once, during the long evening, one of the side doors was opened a little and quickly shut again. Later, the other side door too. Someone had apparently wanted to come in and then thought better of it. Gregor now stationed himself immediately before the living room door, determined to persuade any hesitating visitor to come in, or at least to discover who it might be. But the door was not open again, and he waited in vain. In the early morning, when the doors were locked, they had all wanted to come in. Now that he had opened one door and the other had apparently been opened during the day, no one came in, and even the keys were on the other side of the doors. It was late at night before the gas went out in the living room, and Gregor could easily tell that his parents and his sister had all stayed awake until then, for he could clearly hear the 3 of them stealing away on tiptoe. No one was likely to visit him, not until the morning, that was certain, so he had plenty of time to meditate at his leisure on how he was to arrange his life afresh. But the lofty, empty room in which he had to lie flat on the floor filled him with an apprehension he could not account for, since it had been his very own room for the past 5 years, and with a half-unconscious action, not without a slight feeling of shame, he scuttled under the sofa, where he felt comfortable at once, although his back was a little cramped and he could not lift his head up, and his only regret was that his body was too broad to get the whole of it under the sofa. He stayed there all night, spending the time partly in a light slumber, from which his hunger kept waking him up with a start, and partly in worrying and sketching vague hopes, which all led to the same conclusion, that he must lie low for the present and, by exercising patience and the utmost consideration, help the family to bear the inconvenience he was bound to cause them in his present condition. Very early in the morning, it was still almost night, Gregor had the chance to test the strength of his new resolutions, for his sister, nearly fully dressed, opened the door from the hall and peered in. She did not see him at once, yet when she caught sight of him under the sofa, well, he had to be somewhere, he couldn't have flown away, could he? She was so startled that without being able to help it, she slammed the door shut again. But as if regretting her behavior, she opened the door again immediately and came in on tiptoe, as if she were visiting an invalid or even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward to the very edge of the sofa and watched her. Would she notice that he had left the milk standing, and not for lack of hunger, and would she bring in some other kind of food more to his taste? If she did not do it of her own accord, he would rather starve than draw her attention to the fact, although he felt a wild impulse to dart out from under the sofa, throw himself at her feet, and beg her for something to eat. But his sister at once noticed, with surprise, that the basin was still full, except for a little milk that had been spilled all around it. She lifted it immediately, not with her bare hands, true, but with a cloth, and carried it away. Gregor was wildly curious to know what she would bring instead, and made various speculations about it. Yet what she actually did next, in the goodness of her heart, he could never have guessed at. To find out what he liked, she brought him a whole selection of food, all set out on an old newspaper. There were old, half-decayed vegetables, bones from last night's supper covered with a white sauce that had thickened, some raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese that Gregor would have called uneatable 2 days ago, a dry roll of bread, a buttered roll, and a roll both buttered and salted. Besides all that, she set down again the same basin, into which she had poured some water, and which was apparently to be reserved for his exclusive use. And with fine tact, knowing that Gregor would not eat in her presence, she withdrew quickly and even turned the key, to let him understand that he could take his ease as much as he liked. Gregor's legs all whizzed toward the food. His wounds must have healed completely, moreover, for he felt no disability, which amazed him and made him reflect how more than a month ago he had cut one finger a little with a knife and had still suffered pain from the wound only the day before yesterday. Am I less sensitive now? He thought, and sucked greedily at the cheese, which above all the other edibles attracted him at once and strongly. One after another, and with tears of satisfaction in his eyes, he quickly devoured the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh food, on the other hand, had no charms for him. He could not even stand the smell of it, and actually dragged away to some little distance the things he could eat. He had long finished his meal and was only lying lazily on the same spot when his sister returned the key slowly as a sign for him to retreat. That roused him at once, although he was nearly asleep, and he hurried under the sofa again. But it took considerable self-control for him to stay under the sofa, even for the short time his sister was in the room, since the large meal had swollen his body somewhat, and he was so cramped he could hardly breathe. Slight attacks of breathlessness afflicted him, and his eyes were starting a little out of his head as he watched his unsuspecting sister sweeping together with a broom not only the remains of what he had eaten, but even the things he had not touched, as if these were now of no use to anyone, and hastily shoveling it all into a bucket, which she covered with a wooden lid and carried away. Hardly had she turned her back when Gregor came from under the sofa and stretched and puffed himself out. In this manner Gregor was fed, once in the early morning while his parents and the servant girl were still asleep, and a second time after they had all had their midday dinner, for then his parents took a short nap, and the servant girl could be sent out on some errand or other by his sister. Not that they would have wanted him to starve, of course, but perhaps they could not have borne to know more about his feeding than from hearsay. Perhaps, too, his sister wanted to spare them such little anxieties wherever possible, since they had quite enough to bear as it was. Under what pretext the doctor and the locksmith had been got rid of on that first morning Gregor could not discover, for since what he said was not understood by the others, it never struck any of them, not even his sister, that he could understand what they said, and so whenever his sister came into his room, he had to content himself with hearing her utter only a sigh now and then and an occasional appeal to the saints. Later on, when she had got a little used to the situation, of course she could never get completely used to it, she sometimes threw out a remark which was kindly meant or could be so interpreted. "Well, he liked his dinner today," she would say when Gregor had made a good clearance of his food, and when he had not eaten, which gradually happened more and more often, she would say almost sadly, "Everything's been left standing again." But although Gregor could get no news directly, he overheard a lot from the neighboring rooms, and as soon as voices were audible, he would run to the door of the room concerned and press his whole body against it. In the first few days especially, there was no conversation that did not refer to him somehow, even if only indirectly. For 2 whole days there were family consultations at every mealtime about what should be done, but also between meals the same subject was discussed, for there were always at least 2 members of the family at home, since no one wanted to be alone in the flat, and to leave it quite empty was unthinkable. And on the very first of these days, the household cook. It was not quite clear what and how much she knew of the situation, went down on her knees to his mother and begged leave to go, and when she departed, a quarter of an hour later, she gave thanks for her dismissal, with tears in her eyes, as if for the greatest benefit that could have been conferred on her, and without any prompting swore a solemn oath that she would never say a single word to anyone about what had happened. Now Gregor's sister had to cook too, helping her mother. True, the cooking did not amount to much, for they ate scarcely anything. Gregor was always hearing one of the family vainly urging another to eat and getting no answer but, "Thanks, I've had all I want," or something similar. Perhaps they drank nothing either. Time and again his sister kept asking his father if he wouldn't like some beer, and offered kindly to go and fetch it herself, and when he made no answer suggested that she could ask the concierge to fetch it, so that he need feel no sense of obligation. But then a round "no" came from his father, and no more was said about it. In the course of that very first day, Gregor's father explained the family's financial position and prospects to both his mother and his sister. Now and then he rose from the table to get some voucher or memorandum out of the small safe he had rescued from the collapse of his business 5 years earlier. One could hear him opening the complicated lock and rustling papers out and shutting it again. This statement made by his father was the first cheerful information Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He had been of the opinion that nothing at all was left over from his father's business. At least his father had never said anything to the contrary, and of course he had not asked him directly. At that time, Gregor's sole desire was to do his utmost to help the family to forget as soon as possible the catastrophe that had overwhelmed the business and thrown them all into a state of complete disrepair. And so he had set to work with unusual ardor and almost overnight had become a commercial traveler instead of a little clerk, with of course much greater chances of earning money, and his success was immediately translated into good round coin which he could lay on the table for his amazed and happy family. These had been fine times, and they had never recurred, at least not with the same sense of glory, although later on Gregor had earned so much money that he was able to meet the expenses of the whole household and did so. They had simply got used to it, both the family and Gregor. The money was gratefully accepted and gladly given, but there was no special uprush of warm feeling. With his sister alone had he remained intimate, and it was a secret plan of his that she, who loved music, unlike himself, and could play movingly on the violin, should be sent next year to study at the conservatorium, despite the great expense that would entail, which must be made up in some other way. During his brief visits home, the conservatorium was often mentioned in the talks he had with his sister, but always merely as a beautiful dream which could never come true, and his parents discouraged even these innocent references to it. Yet Gregor had made up his mind firmly about it, and meant to announce the fact with due solemnity on Christmas Day. Such were the thoughts, completely futile in his present condition, that went through his head as he stood clinging upright to the door and listening. Sometimes, out of sheer weariness, he had to give up listening and let his head fall negligently against the door, but he always had to pull himself together again at once, for even the slight sound his head made was audible next door and brought all conversation to a stop. "What can he be doing now?" his father would say after a while, obviously turning toward the door, and only then would the interrupted conversation gradually be set going again. Gregor was now informed as amply as he could wish, for his father tended to repeat himself in his explanations, partly because it was a long time since he had handled such matters, and partly because his mother could not always grasp things at once, that a certain amount of investments, a very small amount it was true, had survived the wreck of their fortunes, and had even increased a little because the dividends had not been touched meanwhile, and besides that, the money Gregor brought home every month, he had kept only a few dollars for himself, had never been quite used up, and now amounted to a small capital sum. Behind the door, Gregor nodded his head eagerly, rejoiced at this evidence of unexpected thrift and foresight. True, he could really have paid off some more of his father's debts to the chief with this extra money, and so brought much nearer the day on which he could quit his job, but doubtless it was better the way his father had arranged it. Yet this capital was by no means sufficient to let the family live on the interest of it. For 1 year, perhaps, or at the most 2, they could live on the principal. That was all. It was simply a sum that ought not to be touched and should be kept for a rainy day. Money for living expenses would have to be earned. Now, his father was still hale enough, but an old man, and he had done no work for the past 5 years and could not be expected to do much. During these 5 years, the first years of leisure in his laborious though unsuccessful life, he had grown rather fat and become sluggish. And Gregor's old mother, how was she to earn a living with her asthma, which troubled her even when she walked through the flat and kept her lying on the sofa every other day, panting for breath beside an open window. And was his sister to earn her bread, she who was still a child of 17, and whose life hitherto had been so pleasant, consisting as it did in dressing herself nicely, sleeping long, helping in the housekeeping, going out to a few modest entertainments, and above all playing the violin? At first, whenever the need for earning money was mentioned, Gregor let go his hold on the door and threw himself down on the cool leather sofa beside it. He felt so hot with shame and grief. Often, he just lay there the long nights through, without sleeping at all, scrabbling for hours on the leather. Or he nerved himself to the great effort of pushing an armchair to the window, then crawled up over the windowsill and, braced against the chair, leaned against the window panes, obviously in some recollection of the sense of freedom that looking out of a window always used to give him. For in reality, day by day, things that were even a little way off were growing dimmer to his sight. The hospital across the street, which he used to execrate for being all too often before his eyes, was now quite beyond his range of vision, and if he had not known that he lived in Charlotte Street, a quiet street, but still a city street, he might have believed that his window gave on a desert waste where gray sky and gray land blended indistinguishably into each other. His quick-witted sister only needed to observe twice that the armchair stood by the window. After that, whenever she had tidied the room, she always pushed the chair back to the same place at the window, and even left the inner casements open. If he could have spoken to her and thanked her for all she had to do for him, he could have borne her ministrations better. As it was, they oppressed him. She certainly tried to make as light as possible of whatever was disagreeable in her task, and as time went on she succeeded, of course, more and more, but time brought more enlightenment to Gregor, too. The way she came in distressed him. Hardly was she in the room when she rushed to the window, without even taking time to shut the door, careful as she was usually to shield the sight of Gregor's room from the others, and as if she were almost suffocating, tore the casements open with hasty fingers, standing then in the open draught for a while, even in the bitterest cold, and drawing deep breaths. This noisy scurry of hers upset Gregor twice a day. He would crouch trembling under the sofa all the time, knowing quite well that she would certainly have spared him such a disturbance had she found it at all possible to stay in his presence without opening the window. On one occasion, about a month after Gregor's metamorphosis, when there was surely no reason for her to be still startled at his appearance, she came a little earlier than usual, and found him gazing out of the window, quite motionless, and thus well placed to look like a bogey. Gregor would not have been surprised had she not come in at all, for she could not immediately open the window while he was there, but not only did she retreat, she jumped back as if in alarm, and banged the door shut. A stranger might well have thought that he had been lying in wait for her there, meaning to bite her. Of course, he hid himself under the sofa at once, but he had to wait until midday before she came again, and she seemed more ill at ease than usual. This made him realize how repulsive the sight of him still was to her, and that it was bound to go on being repulsive, and what an effort it must cost her not to run away even from the sight of the small portion of his body that stuck out from under the sofa. In order to spare her that, therefore, one day he carried a sheet on his back to the sofa. It cost him 4 hours' labor, and arranged it there in such a way as to hide him completely, so that even if she were to bend down she could not see him. Had she considered the sheet unnecessary, she would certainly have stripped it off the sofa again, for it was clear enough that this curtaining and confining of himself was not likely to conduce to Gregor's comfort, but she left it where it was, and Gregor even fancied that he caught a thankful glance from her eye when he lifted the sheet carefully a very little with his head to see how she was taking the new arrangement. For the first fortnight his parents could not bring themselves to the point of entering his room, and he often heard them expressing their appreciation of his sister's activities, whereas formerly they had frequently scolded her for being, as they thought, a somewhat useless daughter. But now, both of them often waited outside the door, his father and his mother, while his sister tidied his room, and as soon as she came out she had to tell them exactly how things were in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he had conducted himself this time, and whether there was not perhaps some slight improvement in his condition. His mother, moreover, began relatively soon to want to visit him, but his father and sister dissuaded her at first with arguments which Gregor listened to very attentively and altogether approved. Later, however, she had to be held back by main force, and when she cried out, "Do let me into Gregor, he is my unfortunate son. Can't you understand that I must go into him?" Gregor thought it might be well to have her come in, not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She understood things, after all, much better than his sister, who was only a child despite the effort she was making, and had perhaps taken on so difficult a task merely out of childish thoughtfulness. Gregor's desire to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the daytime he did not want to show himself at the window, out of consideration for his parents, but he could not crawl very far around the few square yards of floor space he had, nor could he bear lying quietly at rest all during the night, while he was fast losing any interest he had ever taken in food, so that for mere recreation he had formed the habit of crawling crisscross over the walls and ceiling. He especially enjoyed hanging suspended from the ceiling. It was much better than lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely, one's body swung and rocked lightly, and in the almost blissful absorption induced by this suspension, it could happen to his own surprise that he let go and fell plump on the floor. Yet he now had his body much better under control than formerly, and even such a big fall did him no harm. His sister at once remarked the new distraction Gregor had found for himself. He left traces behind him of the sticky stuff on his soles wherever he crawled. And she got the idea in her head of giving him as wide a field as possible to crawl in, and of removing the pieces of furniture that hindered him, above all the chest of drawers and the writing desk. But that was more than she could manage all by herself. She did not dare ask her father to help her, and as for the servant girl, a young creature of 16 who had had the courage to stay on after the cook's departure, she could not be asked to help, for she had begged as a special favor that she might keep the kitchen door locked and open it only on a definite summons. So there was nothing left but to apply to her mother at an hour when her father was out. And the old lady did come, with exclamations of joyful eagerness, which, however, died away at the door of Gregor's room. Gregor's sister, of course, went in first, to see that everything was in order before letting his mother enter. In great haste, Gregor pulled the sheet lower and rucked it more in folds, so that it really looked as if it had been thrown accidentally over the sofa. And this time he did not peer out from under it. He renounced the pleasure of seeing his mother on this occasion, and was only glad that she had come at all. "Come in, he's out of sight," said his sister, obviously leading her mother in by the hand. Gregor could now hear the two women struggling to shift the heavy old chest from its place, and his sister claiming the greater part of the labor for herself, without listening to the admonitions of her mother, who feared she might overstrain herself. It took a long time. After at least a quarter of an hour's tugging, his mother objected that the chest had better be left where it was, for in the first place it was too heavy and could never be got out before his father came home, and standing in the middle of the room like that it would only hamper Gregor's movements. While in the second place, it was not at all certain that removing the furniture would be doing a service to Gregor. She was inclined to think to the contrary. The sight of the naked walls made her own heart heavy, and why shouldn't Gregor have the same feeling, considering that he had been used to his furniture for so long, and might feel forlorn without it? "And doesn't it look?" she concluded in a low voice. In fact, she had been almost whispering all the time, as if to avoid letting Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, hear even the tones of her voice, for she was convinced that he could not understand her words. "Doesn't it look as if we were showing him, by taking away his furniture, that we have given up hope of his ever getting better, and are just leaving him coldly to himself? I think it would be best to keep his room exactly as it has always been, so that when he comes back to us, he will find everything unchanged and be able all the more easily to forget what has happened in between." On hearing these words from his mother, Gregor realized the lack of all direct human speech for the past 2 months together with the monotony of family life must have confused his mind. Otherwise, he could not account for the fact that he had quite earnestly looked forward to having his room emptied of furnishing. Did he really want his warm room, so comfortably fitted with old family furniture, to be turned into a naked den in which he would certainly be able to crawl unhampered in all directions, but at the price of shedding simultaneously all recollection of his human background? He had indeed been so near the brink of forgetfulness that only the voice of his mother, which he had not heard for so long, had drawn him back from it. Nothing should be taken out of his room. Everything must stay as it was. He could not dispense with the good influence of the furniture on his state of mind. And even if the furniture did hamper him in his senseless crawling around and around, that was no drawback, but a great advantage. Unfortunately, his sister was of the contrary opinion. She had grown accustomed, and not without reason, to consider herself an expert in Gregor's affairs as against her parents, and so her mother's advice was now enough to make her determined on the removal not only of the chest and the writing desk, which had been her first intention, but of all the furniture except the indispensable sofa. This determination was not, of course, merely the outcome of childish recalcitrance and of the self-confidence she had recently developed so unexpectedly and at such cost. She had in fact perceived that Gregor needed a lot of space to crawl about in, while on the other hand he never used the furniture at all, so far as could be seen. Another factor might also have been the enthusiastic temperament of an adolescent girl, which seeks to indulge itself on every opportunity, and which now tempted Greta to exaggerate the horror of her brother's circumstances in order that she might do all the more for him. In a room where Gregor lorded it all alone over empty walls, no one, save herself, was likely ever to set foot. And so she was not to be moved from her resolve by her mother, who seemed moreover to be ill at ease in Gregor's room, and therefore unsure of herself, was soon reduced to silence, and helped her daughter as best she could to push the chest outside. Now, Gregor could do without the chest, if need be, but the writing desk he must retain. As soon as the two women had got the chest out of his room, groaning as they pushed it, Gregor stuck his head out from under the sofa to see how he might intervene as kindly and cautiously as possible. But as bad luck would have it, his mother was the first to return, leaving Greta clasping the chest in the room next door, where she was trying to shift it all by herself, without of course moving it from the spot. His mother, however, was not accustomed to the sight of him. It might sicken her, and so in alarm Gregor backed quickly to the other end of the sofa, yet could not prevent the sheet from swaying a little in front. That was enough to put her on the alert. She paused, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Greta. Although Gregor kept reassuring himself that nothing out of the way was happening, but only a few bits of furniture were being changed around, he soon had to admit that all this trotting to and fro of the two women, their little ejaculations, and the scraping of furniture along the floor affected him like a vast disturbance coming from all sides at once, and however much he tucked in his head and legs and cowered to the very floor, he was bound to confess that he would not be able to stand it for long. They were clearing his room out, taking away everything he loved. The chest in which he kept his fret saw and other tools was already dragged off. They were now loosening the writing desk, which had almost sunk into the floor, the desk at which he had done all his homework when he was at the commercial academy, at the grammar school before that, and, yes, even at the primary school. He had no more time to waste in weighing the good intentions of the two women, whose existence he had by now almost forgotten, for they were so exhausted that they were laboring in silence, and nothing could be heard but the heavy scuffling of their feet. And so he rushed out. The women were just leaning against the writing desk in the next room to give themselves a breather, and 4 times changed his direction, since he really did not know what to rescue first. Then on the wall opposite, which was already otherwise cleared, he was struck by the picture of the lady, muffled in so much fur, and quickly crawled up to it and pressed himself to the glass, which was a good surface to hold on to, and comforted his hot belly. This picture, at least, which was entirely hidden beneath him, was going to be removed by nobody. He turned his head toward the door of the living room so as to observe the women when they came back. They had not allowed themselves much of a rest and were already coming. Greta had twined her arm around her mother and was almost supporting her. "Well, what shall we take now?" said Greta, looking around. Her eyes met Gregor's from the wall. She kept her composure, presumably because of her mother, bent her head down to her mother to keep her from looking up, and said, although in a fluttering, unpremeditated voice, "Come, hadn't we better go back to the living room for a moment?" Her intentions were clear enough to Gregor. She wanted to bestow her mother in safety, and then chase him down from the wall. Well, just let her try it. He clung to his picture and would not give it up. He would rather fly in Greta's face. But Greta's words had succeeded in disquieting her mother, who took a step to one side, caught sight of the huge brown mass on the flowered wallpaper, and before she was really conscious that what she saw was Gregor, screamed in a loud, hoarse voice, "Oh God! Oh God!" fell with outspread arms over the sofa as if giving up, and did not move. "Gregor!" cried his sister, shaking her fist and glaring at him. This was the first time she had directly addressed him since his metamorphosis. She ran into the next room for some aromatic essence with which to rouse her mother from her fainting fit. Gregor wanted to help too. There was still time to rescue the picture, but he was stuck fast to the glass and had to tear himself loose. He then ran after his sister into the next room, as if he could advise her, as he used to do, but then had to stand helplessly behind her. She, meanwhile, searched among various small bottles, and when she turned around, started in alarm at the sight of him. One bottle fell on the floor and broke. A splinter of glass cut Gregor's face, and some kind of corrosive medicine splashed him. Without pausing a moment longer, Greta gathered up all the bottles she could carry and ran to her mother with them. She banged the door shut with her foot. Gregor was now cut off from his mother, who was perhaps nearly dying because of him. He dared not open the door for fear of frightening away his sister, who had to stay with her mother. There was nothing he could do but wait, and harassed by self-reproach and worry, he began now to crawl to and fro over everything, walls, furniture, and ceiling, and finally, in his despair, when the whole room seemed to be reeling around him, fell down onto the middle of the big table. A little while elapsed. Gregor was still lying there feebly, and all around was quiet. Perhaps that was a good omen. Then the doorbell rang. The servant girl was of course locked in her kitchen, and Greta would have to open the door. It was his father. "What's been happening?" were his first words. Greta's face must have told him everything. Greta answered in a muffled voice, apparently hiding her head on his breast. "Mother has been fainting, but she's better now. Gregor's broken loose." "Just what I expected," said his father. "Just what I've been telling you, but you women would never listen." It was clear to Gregor that his father had taken the worst interpretation of Greta's all-too-brief statement and was assuming that Gregor had been guilty of some violent act. Therefore, Gregor must now try to propitiate his father, since he had neither time nor means for an explanation, and so he fled to the door of his own room and crouched against it, to let his father see as soon as he came in from the hall that his son had the good intention of getting back into his room immediately, and that it was not necessary to drive him there, but that if only the door were opened he would disappear at once. Yet his father was not in the mood to perceive such fine distinctions. "Ah!" he cried as soon as he appeared, in a tone that sounded at once angry and exultant. Gregor drew his head back from the door and lifted it to look at his father. Truly, this was not the father he had imagined to himself. Admittedly, he had been too absorbed of late in his new recreation of crawling over the ceiling to take the same interest as before in what was happening elsewhere in the flat, and he ought really to be prepared for some changes. And yet, could that be his father? The man who used to lie wearily sunk in bed whenever Gregor set out on a business journey, who welcomed him back of an evening lying in a long chair in a dressing gown, who could not really rise to his feet but only lifted his arms in greeting, and on the rare occasions when he did go out with his family, on 1 or 2 Sundays a year and on highest holidays, walked between Gregor and his mother, who were slow walkers anyhow, even more slowly than they did, muffled in his old greatcoat, shuffling laboriously forward with the help of his crook-handled stick, which he set down most cautiously at every step, and, whenever he wanted to say anything, nearly always came to a full stop and gathered his escort around him. Now he was standing there in fine shape, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, such as bank messengers wear. His strong double chin bulged over the stiff, high collar of his jacket. From under his bushy eyebrows his black eyes darted fresh and penetrating glances. His one-time tangled white hair had been combed flat on either side of a shining and carefully exact parting. He pitched his cap, which bore a gold monogram, probably the badge of some bank, in a wide sweep across the room onto a sofa, and with the tail ends of his jacket thrown back, his hands in his trouser pockets, advanced with a grim visage toward Gregor. Likely enough, he did not himself know what he meant to do. At any rate, he lifted his feet uncommonly high, and Gregor was dumbfounded at the enormous size of his shoe soles. But Gregor could not risk standing up to him, aware as he had been from the very first day of his new life that his father believed only the severest measures suitable for dealing with him. And so he ran before his father, stopping when he stopped and scuttling forward again when his father made any kind of move. In this way they circled the room several times without anything decisive happening. Indeed, the whole operation did not even look like a pursuit, because it was carried out so slowly. And so Gregor did not leave the floor, for he feared that his father might take as a piece of peculiar wickedness any excursion of his over the walls or the ceiling. All the same, he could not stay this course much longer, for while his father took one step, he had to carry out a whole series of movements. He was already beginning to feel breathless, just as in his former life his lungs had not been very dependable. As he was staggering along, trying to concentrate his energy on running, hardly keeping his eyes open, in his dazed state never even thinking of any other escape than simply going forward, and having almost forgotten that the walls were free to him, which in this room were well provided with finely carved pieces of furniture full of knobs and crevices. Suddenly, something lightly flung landed close behind him and rolled before him. It was an apple. A second apple followed immediately. Gregor came to a stop in alarm. There was no point in running on, for his father was determined to bombard him. He had filled his pockets with fruit from the dish on the sideboard, and was now shying apple after apple, without taking particularly good aim for the moment. The small red apples rolled about the floor as if magnetized and cannoned into each other. An apple thrown without much force grazed Gregor's back and glanced off harmlessly, but another following immediately landed right on his back and sank in. Gregor wanted to drag himself forward, as if this startling, incredible pain could be left behind him, but he felt as if nailed to the spot, and flattened himself out in a complete derangement of all his senses. With his last conscious look, he saw the door of his room being torn open, and his mother rushing out ahead of his screaming sister, in her underbodice, for her daughter had loosened her clothing to let her breathe more freely and recover from her swoon. He saw his mother rushing toward his father, leaving one after another behind her on the floor, her loosened petticoats, stumbling over her petticoats straight to his father and embracing him, in complete union with him. But here Gregor's sight began to fail, with her hands clasped around his father's neck as she begged for her son's life.